The morning sun cast long shadows across the Afghan mountains as Captain Marcus Rivera adjusted his radio headset for the third time in 10 minutes. His palms were sweating despite the cold mountain air, and every instinct told him something was about to go terribly wrong. The operation, codenamed Silent Thunder, had been planned for weeks, but now, sitting in the makeshift command post overlooking the valley, Rivera couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. Lieutenant Sarah Chen crouched beside him, her sniper rifle trained on the compound below through the scope. The intelligence had been solid, or so they thought. A high-value target, a Taliban commander responsible for multiple attacks on NATO forces, was supposedly holed up in the stone fortress that had been carved into the mountainside decades ago. The compound was isolated, surrounded by rocky terrain that made approach difficult but provided excellent cover for their team. Ghost One, this is command, Rivera spoke into his radio, his voice steady despite the knots in his stomach. Status report. Sergeant James Mitchell's voice crackled back through the static. Mitchell led the assault team, 6 highly trained soldiers who had been moving through the valley since before dawn. They were the best of the best, hand-picked for operations like this one. Rivera had worked with Mitchell for 3 years, and the man had never failed to complete a mission. Command, we're in position, target building in sight. No movement detected on the perimeter, Mitchell reported. His team had managed to get within 50 meters of the compound without detection, a testament to their training and the careful planning that had gone into this operation. Rivera glanced at his watch, 0700 hours, right on schedule. The plan was simple in theory. Mitchell's team would breach the main entrance while Chen provided overwatch from their elevated position. A second team, led by Corporal Davis, would secure the rear exit to prevent any escapes. Intelligence suggested minimal resistance, maybe 4 or 5 fighters at most. Chen shifted beside him, adjusting her scope. Something doesn't feel right, Captain, she whispered, her eyes still pressed to the rifle scope. I've been watching for 20 minutes and there's been zero movement. No guards, no sentries, nothing. Even if they're trying to lay low, someone should be moving around in there. Rivera had been thinking the same thing. In his 8 years of military service, he had learned to trust his gut, and right now his gut was screaming warnings. But the intelligence was solid, confirmed by multiple sources. The target was in there, and this might be their only chance to get him. Maybe they're just being careful, Rivera said, though he didn't believe it himself. Could be they know we're in the area. The radio crackled again. Command, this is Ghost 2. Corporal Davis's voice was tense. Rear position secured, but I'm seeing some disturbing signs back here. Looks like there might have been recent activity, but everything's abandoned now. Found some empty shell casings, still warm. Rivera's blood ran cold. Recent activity meant they might have missed their window, or worse, they might be walking into an ambush. He was about to call off the operation when Mitchell's voice came through the radio, urgent and clipped. Command, we've got movement inside. Thermal imaging shows at least 3 heat signatures in the main room. Target appears to be present. Request permission to breach. Rivera hesitated. Every fiber of his being told him to abort, but Mitchell was right there, 50 meters from completing the mission. They had spent weeks tracking this target, and intelligence suggested he would be moving to a new location within days. This might be their only shot. Permission granted, Ghost 1. Execute breach in 60 seconds. Chen lowered her rifle and looked at Rivera. Captain, I really think we should. I know, Rivera cut her off, but we're committed now. Keep your scope on that building and watch for anything unusual. The next 60 seconds stretched like hours. Rivera watched through his binoculars as Mitchell's team prepared for the breach. They moved like shadows, each man knowing exactly where to be and when to be there. These weren't ordinary soldiers, they were special operations, the kind of men who could complete impossible missions and make it look easy. Breaching now, Mitchell's voice was calm, professional. Rivera held his breath as he watched the team flow into the building like water. For a moment, everything seemed to go according to plan. The breach was clean, no resistance at the entry point. The team disappeared into the dark interior of the compound, and for several seconds, the only sound was the wind whistling through the mountain peaks. Then all hell broke loose. The explosion shook the ground beneath Rivera's feet, a massive blast that sent debris flying hundreds of meters in every direction. The entire front wall of the compound collapsed, and smoke billowed up from what had been the main entrance just seconds before. Ghost 1, respond, Rivera shouted into his radio, his voice hoarse with panic. Ghost 1, come in. Static filled his earpiece. Chen was already adjusting her scope, trying to see through the smoke and dust that now obscured the compound. I can't see anything, Captain. The whole front section is gone. Rivera's hands shook as he tried Mitchell's frequency again. Ghost 1, respond immediately. Nothing, not even static now, just the horrible silence that every military commander dreads. The silence that means good men are down, possibly dead, and there's nothing you can do about it. Ghost 2, report, Rivera called to Davis's team at the rear of the compound. Command, we're okay back here, but that blast, Davis's voice was strained. Sir, the whole building is coming down. I can see secondary explosions inside. This place was wired to blow. Rivera felt sick. They had walked right into it, exactly as his instincts had warned him. The intelligence had been compromised, or worse, it had been planted. The Taliban commander had known they were coming and had turned the compound into a death trap. Chen grabbed Rivera's arm. Captain, look at the smoke. It's not just from the explosion. I think there's a fire spreading inside. Through his binoculars, Rivera could see she was right. Orange flames were beginning to lick through the smoke, and the ancient wooden beams inside the stone structure were starting to catch. If any of Mitchell's team had survived the initial blast, they wouldn't survive much longer. Ghost 2, can you reach the main building? Rivera asked desperately. Negative, sir. The whole front section collapsed and the fire's spreading fast. Even if we could get through the rubble, the smoke is too thick. Rivera stared at the burning compound, his mind racing through options. Standard protocol in a situation like this was to pull back and wait for reinforcements, but reinforcements were hours away. If Mitchell's team was alive in there, they had minutes, not hours. Sir, Chen said quietly, I'm reading multiple heat signatures moving away from the compound. Looks like 8, maybe 10 people heading northeast through the valley. Rivera swung his binoculars in that direction. Through the smoke and haze, he could make out figures moving quickly through the rocky terrain. The Taliban fighters had been waiting for them, had let them walk into the trap, and now they were escaping. Those bastards were never in that building, Rivera said through gritted teeth. They set it up, waited for us to go in, and triggered the explosives remotely. The radio crackled with Davis's voice again. Command, the fire's getting worse. We need to make a decision. If anyone's alive in there, we're running out of time. Rivera closed his eyes for a moment, trying to think clearly through the rage and panic that threatened to overwhelm him. 6 good men had gone into that building. 6 men with families, with futures, with everything to live for. And now they were trapped in a burning, collapsed building because he had ignored his instincts and followed bad intelligence. But even as despair began to set in, Rivera forced himself to focus. He was their commanding officer, and it was his job to bring his people home, all of them dead or alive. Ghost 2, maintain your position and keep watching for survivors, Rivera ordered. Chen, keep tracking those heat signatures. I want to know exactly where they're going. Rivera grabbed his radio and switched to the emergency frequency. Base, this is Falcon Command. We have a code black situation. Repeat, code black, multiple casualties, structure fire, immediate extraction required. The response came back within seconds. Falcon Command, this is Base. Understand code black. Extraction team is 30 minutes out. Can you maintain position? 30 minutes. Rivera looked at the burning compound and knew 30 minutes might as well be 30 hours. The ancient wooden beams were fully engulfed now, and the stone walls were beginning to crack from the heat. Whatever chance Mitchell's team had was measured in minutes, not hours. Negative, Base. 30 minutes is too long. We need immediate support. Falcon Command, nearest available support is a Ghost Recon unit operating in your sector, but they're currently engaged in their own operation. Stand by. Ghost Recon, Rivera had heard of them but had never worked with the elite unit directly. They were supposed to be the best of the best, specialists in impossible missions and hopeless situations. If anyone could help, it would be them. But as Rivera watched the flames grow higher and the smoke grow thicker, he couldn't help but think that even Ghost Recon might be too late. The compound was turning into an inferno, and with each passing minute, the chances of finding survivors grew smaller. Chen suddenly grabbed his arm. Captain, I've got movement in the building. Thermal signature, northeast corner, ground level. Someone's alive in there. Rivera's heart leaped. Are you sure? Positive, it's faint, but there's definitely someone moving around in that section. The fire hasn't reached there yet, but it will soon. Rivera looked at the collapsed entrance, the spreading fire, the thick smoke that made visibility nearly impossible. Even if someone was alive in there, how could they possibly reach them? The building was a death trap, and any rescue attempt would likely just add to the casualty count. But as he watched that faint heat signature moving in the northeast corner of the building, Rivera knew he couldn't give up. Not yet, not while there was still a chance that some of his men might make it home. The question was, how long could they hold out and would help arrive in time? As if in answer to his thoughts, the radio crackled with a new voice, calm and professional. Falcon Command, this is Ghost Recon Actual. We're inbound to your position. Hold fast. Colonel Nathan Cross pressed his eye against the scope of his rifle as the helicopter descended toward the burning compound. From 1,500 feet, the situation looked worse than the radio chatter had suggested. Thick black smoke poured from what remained of the ancient stone building, and the heat signatures on his thermal imaging told a grim story. At least 6 soldiers were unaccounted for, trapped somewhere in that inferno. 2 minutes to insertion, the pilot's voice crackled through Cross's headset. Master Sergeant Alina Vasquez sat across from him, checking her gear for the 3rd time. Beside her, Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson was already prepping his explosive charges, and Corporal Lisa Park was running final diagnostics on her electronic warfare equipment. This was Ghost Recon Team Alpha, 4 of the most elite soldiers in the American military. Cross had been leading Ghost Recon operations for 8 years, and he had seen situations that would break ordinary men. But something about this mission felt different. Maybe it was the desperation in Captain Rivera's voice over the radio, or maybe it was the fact that 6 soldiers were trapped in a building that was rapidly becoming a crematorium. Either way, Cross knew they were racing against time. "What's the assessment, Colonel?" Vasquez asked, her voice calm despite the chaos below. She had been Cross's second in command for 4 years, and her steady demeanor had saved their lives more times than he could count. "Bad intelligence led them into a trap," Cross replied, not taking his eye off the scope. "Building was rigged to blow, front section collapsed, and now we've got a structure fire spreading fast. At least 1 survivor confirmed in the northeast section, possibly more." Thompson looked up from his charges. "Standard approach won't work. The main entrance is buried under tons of rubble and the fire's blocking most access points. We're going to need to get creative." Cross switched his thermal imaging to ground level, trying to get a better picture of what they were dealing with. The compound had been carved into the mountainside decades ago, which meant it might have natural cave systems or passages that weren't visible from above. It was a long shot, but it might be their only option for reaching the trapped soldiers. "Park, what can you tell me about the structure?" Cross asked. Corporal Park was already running scans with her portable ground-penetrating radar. "It's more complex than it looks, sir. The building extends back into the mountain, possibly connecting to natural cave systems. I'm detecting hollow spaces behind the main structure, and it looks like there might be an air shaft or ventilation system running along the eastern wall." Cross felt a glimmer of hope. If they could access the building from behind, they might be able to reach the survivors before the fire spread to their location. But it would require precise timing and a lot of luck. 30 seconds to insertion, the pilot announced. Cross looked at his team. "Here's the situation. We're dealing with a structure fire, possible building collapse, and unknown enemy presence in the area. Our primary objective is extracting survivors from that building. Secondary objective is providing medical support to the wounded. Questions?" "Rules of engagement?" Vasquez asked. "We're in hostile territory, and this was clearly an ambush. Assume any unidentified personnel are hostile unless proven otherwise. But remember, our priority is those trapped soldiers, not hunting down the fighters who set this trap." The helicopter touched down on a flat section of ground about 200 meters from the burning compound. Cross could feel the heat from the fire even at this distance, and the smoke was thick enough to sting his eyes. As soon as they hit the ground, the team was moving, their movements coordinated with the precision that came from years of training together. Captain Rivera was waiting for them at the command post, his face streaked with soot and his eyes red from smoke. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in the past hour. "Colonel Cross, thank God you're here," Rivera said, his voice hoarse. "We've got at least 1 confirmed survivor in the northeast section of the building, but the fire's spreading in that direction. I estimate we have maybe 10 minutes before that section is completely engulfed." Cross nodded grimly. 10 minutes wasn't much time, but they had worked with less. "What's the situation with enemy forces?" "Thermal imaging shows they've withdrawn to the northeast, probably to a safe distance where they can observe the operation. My guess is they're waiting to see if we'll send more people into their trap." Vasquez was already studying the compound through her scope. "I count 3 possible entry points, but 2 are blocked by debris from the collapse. The eastern wall has what looks like a ventilation opening about 6 meters up." Cross pulled out his tactical tablet and called up the building schematics Park had transmitted from the helicopter. "Park, what's behind that ventilation opening?" "Looks like it connects to a passage that runs along the interior wall. If we can get through there, we should be able to access the northeast section without going through the fire. Thompson was examining the wall with his binoculars. I can scale that wall and place charges around the ventilation opening, create an entry point big enough for us to get through. Cross weighed their options. It was risky, they would be exposed while climbing the wall, and they had no idea what they might find inside the passage. But it was better than trying to fight their way through the collapsed front entrance or waiting for the fire to consume the entire building. Do it, Cross decided. Thompson, you and Park handle the entry point. Vasquez, you're with me. We'll provide cover and then follow you in. As Thompson began preparing his climbing gear, the radio crackled with Davis's voice from the rear of the compound. Command, I'm seeing movement in the building. Someone's moving around in there and they're trying to signal us. Rivera grabbed his binoculars and focused on the northeast section of the building. Through the smoke, he could just make out a faint light flickering in what appeared to be a window opening. It was definitely a signal, 3 short flashes, repeated over and over. That's Morse code, Rivera said, his voice filled with hope for the first time since the explosion. 3 short flashes, that's the letters in Morse. They're signaling for help. Cross felt his pulse quicken. If the survivors were conscious and coherent enough to signal, that meant they were in better shape than he had dared hope. But it also meant time was running out fast. The signal was getting weaker, suggesting that smoke was filling their section of the building. Thompson had his climbing gear ready and was approaching the eastern wall. The ancient stone was rough and weathered, providing plenty of handholds, but the fire had heated the entire structure, making the rock surface hot to the touch. Beginning ascent, Thompson reported through his radio. Cross watched through his scope as Thompson scaled the wall with the fluid grace of someone who had spent his career climbing impossible obstacles. The sergeant reached the ventilation opening in less than 2 minutes and immediately began placing shaped charges around the stone framework. Charges set, Thompson reported. Everyone clear the area, detonating in 10 seconds. The explosion was much smaller than the one that had destroyed the front of the building, but it was perfectly placed. The ancient stone crumbled away, leaving an opening large enough for a person to crawl through. Thompson disappeared into the dark passage without hesitation. I'm inside, his voice crackled through the radio. Passage is narrow but stable. I can see light coming from the northeast section and I'm hearing voices, definitely survivors. Cross felt a surge of relief, but he knew they weren't safe yet. The fire was still spreading, and they had no idea how many survivors there were or what condition they were in. Park, you're next, Cross ordered. Vasquez and I will follow. Park scaled the wall with the same efficiency as Thompson and disappeared into the passage. Cross was about to follow when Rivera grabbed his arm. Colonel, I'm coming with you, Rivera said firmly. Those are my men in there. Cross looked at the captain's determined face and nodded. Rivera had led these men into the trap, and he deserved the chance to help get them out. The passage was cramped and filled with smoke, but it was stable. Cross could hear Thompson's voice ahead, talking to someone. As they crawled through the narrow tunnel, the voices became clearer, and Cross realized with relief that there were multiple survivors. They emerged into a small chamber that had been carved out of the natural rock. The room was filled with smoke, but it wasn't as bad as Cross had expected. 3 soldiers were huddled against the far wall, and Thompson was already administering first aid to a 4th who was lying on the ground. Sergeant Mitchell, Rivera called out, recognizing his team leader despite the soot and blood covering his face. Mitchell looked up, his eyes bright with relief. Captain, we thought we were done for. The whole front section came down on us, but Peterson found this passage just before the explosion. Got us back here, but he's hurt bad. Cross knelt beside the wounded soldier. Peterson was unconscious, with obvious head trauma and a compound fracture in his left arm. He needed immediate medical attention, but he was alive. How many more? Cross asked. 6 of us went in, Mitchell replied. Peterson's the worst hurt, but Johnson has some burns and Williams might have a concussion. Richardson and Evans are mobile. Park was already setting up a portable medical kit while Vasquez examined the other wounded soldiers. It was better than Cross had hoped. All 6 soldiers were alive, and most of them could move under their own power. But their relief was short-lived. The radio crackled with Davis's urgent voice. All units, we've got incoming. At least 10 fighters moving toward your position from the northwest. They're armed and moving fast. Cross swore under his breath. The Taliban fighters who had set the trap were coming back, probably to finish off any survivors and eliminate the rescue team. They were trapped in a narrow passage with wounded soldiers and limited ammunition. How long until the passage is compromised? Cross asked Thompson. The fire's spreading along the main corridor. I'd say we have maybe 5 minutes before this whole section is engulfed. Cross made a quick decision. Vasquez, you and Park get the wounded ready to move. Thompson, Richardson, Evans, you're with me. We're going to buy some time. Rivera checked his sidearm. I'm going with you, Colonel. Cross nodded. They would need every weapon they could get. As they prepared to defend their position, Cross couldn't help but think about the irony of the situation. They had come to rescue trapped soldiers, and now they were all trapped together, but at least now they had a fighting chance. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the passage, and Cross raised his rifle. In a few minutes, they would know whether their rescue mission would end in triumph or tragedy. The radio in Cross's ear crackled one more time. Ghost Recon, this is Falcon Base. Extraction team is 15 minutes out. Can you hold your position? Cross looked around at the smoke-filled chamber, the wounded soldiers, and his small team preparing for what might be their final battle. 15 minutes felt like an eternity. Copy Falcon Base, Cross replied quietly. We'll hold as long as we can. The sound of boots on stone echoed through the narrow passage as Colonel Cross positioned his team for what could be their final stand. The smoke was getting thicker, making it harder to breathe, and the heat from the spreading fire was becoming unbearable. Behind him, Vasquez worked frantically to stabilize Peterson, while Park prepared the other wounded soldiers for what might be a running firefight. Cross checked his ammunition count, 2 full magazines plus the one in his rifle. Not much for a prolonged engagement, but it would have to do. Beside him, Thompson was setting up a defensive position using chunks of rubble from the collapsed ceiling, while Rivera crouched near the passage entrance with his sidearm ready. Contact front, Thompson whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackling of flames in the distance. Through the smoke-filled passage, Cross could see the dim glow of flashlights moving toward their position. The Taliban fighters were being cautious, probably expecting some kind of resistance, but they were definitely coming. Cross counted at least 4 separate light sources, which meant they were outnumbered 2-1. The radio in Cross's ear crackled with Davis's voice from outside the building. Ghost Recon, I count 12 hostiles entering the building through various breach points. They're coordinating their approach, and they've got heavy weapons. 12 fighters with heavy weapons against 7 soldiers, 4 of whom were wounded. The odds weren't good, but Cross had faced worse. The key was to use the narrow passage to their advantage. The enemy couldn't bring all their firepower to bear at once in such a confined space. Richardson, Evans, how are you feeling? Cross asked the 2 soldiers who had been cleared for action. Ready to fight, sir, Richardson replied immediately. The young soldier's left arm was in a makeshift sling, but he could still handle a rifle. Evans nodded grimly, wiping blood from a gash on his forehead. Cross made a quick tactical decision. Thompson, you and Richardson take the left side of the passage. Evans, you're with me on the right. Rivera, fall back with the wounded and be ready to provide cover if they get through us. The first Taliban fighter appeared in the passage opening, his AK-47 sweeping the chamber as he tried to locate the trapped soldiers. Cross let him advance 3 steps into the narrow corridor before pulling the trigger. The shot echoed deafeningly in the confined space, and the fighter dropped immediately. What followed was chaos. The confined space erupted in muzzle flashes and the deafening roar of automatic weapons. The Taliban fighters were trying to rush the chamber, but the narrow passage forced them to come single file, exactly as Cross had hoped. Thompson and Richardson were laying down accurate fire from the left side, while Cross and Evans covered the right. But the enemy had advantages too. They had superior numbers, and they weren't worried about conserving ammunition. Bullets ricocheted off the stone walls, and Cross could hear fragments of rock striking his body armor. One round passed so close to his head that he felt the heat from the bullet's passage. Getting low on ammo, Thompson called out between shots. Cross checked his own magazine count, 1 full mag left plus about half of his current one. At this rate, they would be out of ammunition in minutes, and the enemy seemed to have plenty more fighters waiting in reserve. That's when the radio crackled with a new voice, calm and professional. Ghost Recon Actual, this is Spectre 1-1. We have your building surrounded and are beginning suppression of hostile forces. Keep your heads down. Cross had never been so happy to hear an unfamiliar call sign. Spectre 1-1 was an AC-130 gunship, one of the most devastating close air support platforms in the American arsenal. If they had eyes on the building, the tide of battle was about to turn dramatically. The sound that followed was unlike anything Cross had ever experienced inside a building. The AC-130's 25 cannon began firing on the Taliban positions outside, and each round hit with the force of a small artillery shell. The entire mountain seemed to shake with each impact, and dust and debris rained down from the ceiling of their chamber. "All friendly forces inside the building, mark your position with infrared strobes," came the calm voice of the AC-130's weapons officer. "We're going to light up everything that doesn't have a strobe." Park quickly distributed IR strobes to everyone in the chamber, while the gunfire in the passage died down to sporadic shots. The Taliban fighters were clearly confused and disoriented by the sudden arrival of air support. "Strobes activated," Cross reported. "We're in the northeast section of the building, main chamber." "Copy, Ghost Recon, we have you marked. All hostiles inside the building are being engaged now." What happened next was a masterclass in precision air support. The AC-130's crew used a combination of infrared imaging and radio communication to systematically eliminate every Taliban position in the building without endangering the trapped soldiers. The 40 cannon rounds punched through stone walls with surgical precision, and the sound of enemy gunfire gradually faded to nothing. But their problems weren't over. The fire was still spreading, and the air in the chamber was becoming toxic from smoke inhalation. Peterson was unconscious again, and Johnson was starting to show signs of smoke poisoning. "We need to move now," Vasquez said urgently. "The smoke is getting worse, and I'm losing Peterson." Cross looked around the chamber desperately. The passage they had used to enter was now completely blocked by debris from the AC-130's cannon fire, and the main corridors were either collapsed or filled with flames. They were trapped as effectively as they had been before the air support arrived. "Spectre 1-1, we need an emergency extraction. Our exit route is blocked, and we have wounded who need immediate medical attention." "Copy, Ghost Recon, stand by for dust-off. We're clearing a landing zone on the eastern side of the building." Through the smoke-filled chamber, Cross could hear the distinctive sound of the AC-130's 105 howitzer firing repeated rounds at the eastern wall of the compound. The massive shells were blowing huge chunks out of the ancient stone structure, creating an opening large enough for helicopter extraction. "Dust-off is inbound 2 minutes out," the radio crackled. "Be ready to move fast." Those were the longest 2 minutes of Cross's life. Peterson had stopped breathing, and Vasquez was performing CPR while fighting off the effects of smoke inhalation herself. Johnson was barely conscious, and even the uninjured soldiers were starting to stumble from oxygen deprivation. Finally, the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors filled the air, and Cross could see the downdraft from the rotor wash clearing some of the smoke from their chamber. A 60 Black Hawk appeared in the opening the AC-130 had created, hovering just outside the building with its side door open. "Go, go, go," Cross shouted. What followed was a perfectly executed evacuation under fire. The helicopter crew had repelling lines ready, and within 30 seconds they had Peterson and Johnson loaded onto stretchers and secured inside the aircraft. Richardson and Evans followed, then Rivera, then Park and Vasquez. Cross was the last man out, and as the helicopter lifted away from the burning compound, he looked back at the stone building that had nearly become a tomb for 7 good soldiers. The entire structure was now engulfed in flames, and he knew that in another few minutes, the chamber where they had sheltered would have been uninhabitable. "All packages secure," the crew chief reported over the radio. "Medical team is standing by at Bagram." Cross allowed himself to relax for the first time in what felt like hours. Peterson was stable, Vasquez had managed to get him breathing again, and the helicopter's medical equipment was keeping him alive until they could get him to proper surgical facilities. The other wounded soldiers would recover fully with time and proper treatment. As the helicopter banked toward Bagram Air Base, Cross's radio crackled with Captain Rivera's voice. "Ghost Recon Actual, this is Falcon Command. I don't know how to thank you. You saved my men's lives." Cross keyed his radio and replied in his characteristic calm tone, "Target secured, Falcon Command, that's what we do." But privately, Cross knew this had been one of the closest calls of his career. The mission had succeeded, but it had been a near thing. If the AC-130 hadn't arrived when it did, if the helicopter extraction had been delayed by even a few minutes, if any one of a dozen small things had gone wrong, they would have lost good soldiers. As Bagram Air Base came into view, Cross thought about the intelligence failure that had led to the ambush in the first place. Someone would have to answer for that, and steps would have to be taken to prevent similar incidents in the future. But that was a problem for another day. Today, 7 soldiers who should have died were going home alive. The helicopter touched down at the medical facility, and within minutes Peterson was in surgery while the other wounded soldiers received the care they needed. Cross and his team debriefed with intelligence officers, providing detailed accounts of what had gone wrong with the original operation and how the Taliban fighters had managed to set such an effective trap. Later that evening, as Cross sat in the mess hall at Bagram, Rivera approached his table carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Mind if I sit?" Rivera asked. Cross gestured to the empty chair across from him. Rivera sat down heavily, looking like a man who had aged years in a single day. "Peterson's going to make it," Rivera said without preamble. "Doctors say he'll be back to full duty in 6 months. Johnson has some lung damage from smoke inhalation, but nothing permanent. The others will be fine." Cross nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized was there. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't shown up when you did," Rivera continued. "Those men trusted me to lead them, and I walked them right into a death trap." Cross looked at the captain thoughtfully. "You followed the intelligence you were given, intelligence that was either compromised or deliberately planted. That's not a command failure, that's an intelligence failure. The fact that you got them out alive after everything went wrong, that's good leadership." Rivera was quiet for a moment, staring into his coffee. "How do you do it? How do you make life or death decisions knowing that good people might die because of your choices?" Cross had been asked that question before, by younger officers and by himself in the dark hours after difficult missions. You make the best decision you can with the information you have, and then you live with the consequences, but you never stop trying to bring everyone home. The mess hall was mostly empty now, just a few late diners and some maintenance crew grabbing a quick meal before their night shift. Outside, the constant background noise of a major military base continued, helicopters coming and going, vehicles moving supplies, the everyday sounds of a war that never seemed to end. "The men you saved today," Cross continued, "they'll go home to their families because you made the hard choices when everything was falling apart. They'll see their kids grow up, attend graduations, walk their daughters down the aisle. That's what matters in the end." Rivera nodded slowly, some of the tension finally leaving his shoulders. "Thank you, Colonel, for everything." As Rivera left the mess hall, Cross pulled out his satellite phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Cross, everything okay?" "Hey, Sarah, yeah, everything's fine. Tough day, but everyone's coming home." Cross's wife had been a military spouse for 15 years, and she always knew when a mission had been particularly difficult. "Tell me about it when you get home," she said simply. "The kids want a video call with you tomorrow if you have time." "I'll make time," Cross promised. "I love you." "Love you too. Be safe." Cross ended the call and sat in the quiet mess hall for a few more minutes, thinking about home and family and the strange life he had chosen. Tomorrow there would be another mission, another crisis, another group of soldiers who needed help in an impossible situation. But tonight 7 good men were alive who might not have been, and that was enough. In the end, that was always enough. The radio on the table next to him crackled with routine traffic, supply requests, personnel movements, the everyday business of running a war. But Cross wasn't really listening. He was thinking about Peterson in the hospital, about Richardson and Evans who would be back to full duty in a few weeks, about Sergeant Mitchell who had kept his team together in an impossible situation. These were the moments that made everything worthwhile, not the medals or the recognition, but the simple fact that good people would go home to their families because he and his team had done their job. Cross finished his coffee, gathered his gear, and headed back to his quarters. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new missions, new opportunities to make a difference in an uncertain world. But tonight, for the first time in days, he would sleep peacefully, knowing that when Ghost Recon had been called, they had answered, and when soldiers needed help, they had delivered. "Target secured, indeed."